Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of African American history in the University of Houston. It is always a pleasure to have you as an interview. You have recently published a very thoroughgoing retrospective volume with international publishers, African Americans, and a New History. Uh, Now, the fascinating part about where our shared trajectory is you published your counter revolution of 1776 almost simultaneous when I produced completely autonomous and independent of you a documentary about one character that you highlight in that book, Aaron Briggs, who was an enslaved person held in captivity that attacked the Gaspee ship and was involved with the Brown family. I'm wondering how it was that you approached the archives and the chronology, because when I took on the task of trying to make a documentary of these materials, it was so big and it goes so far back in time. What is your modus for going into the archives?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, to put it in broader perspective, um, I had long been dissatisfied with the trajectory of historiography of the United States, not least its grimy and seamy origins. But politically, many of those I respected tended to have a point of view that ultimately I came not to share. But as you know, in political movements, and I'm not just a scholar, I consider myself to be an activist and a revolutionary, you oftentimes feel that you have to make compromises with regard to some positions that your comrades take. I mean, that's the essence of the concept of democratic centralism, for example. But what happened is that with the implosion of the socialist camp, and beginning, let us say, in November 1989, culminating in December 1991, the kinds of evaluations that came from that camp and those who were affiliated with them in the United States, it seemed to me all bets were off. That is to say, things were in a state of historiographical flux. And I think that motivated me to revisit many issues felt to be settled, not least the formation of the United States of America, which many, including today, many who consider themselves to be revolutionary, they consider it to be a great leap forward for humanity. But ask them about the Native American question, for example. Was the creation of the United States was so great that even those who were subjected to genocide saluted. This whole thing is bizarre. It doesn't make any sense. I'm doing a project as we speak on the U.S. Pacific Northwest and the Canadian Southwest, to be technically precise. British Columbia in Canada, Oregon, the state of Washington on the U.S. side. And it dovetails with what I found in my Texas book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, where you might recall that the subtitle is The Roots of U.S. Fascism. And in exploring that latter concept, one of the conclusions I arrived at was that a lot of the momentum for uprooting the indigenous, it really came from settler descendants, working class, middle class settler descendants. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, what I'll be writing about soon is that in the 1840s and the 1850s in particular, that the settlers were totally dissatisfied with the U.S. military. So they decided to organize autonomously and set up militia because they felt that the U.S. military was too weak-kneed in uprooting the indigenous. And in fact, you can, of course, if you're so inclined, go to a search engine and plug in Governor Isaac Ingalls Stevens of Washington Territory in the 1850s. He implements martial law and arrest the chief judicial officer of that territory. Because interestingly enough, and this will shed light on the fraught question of miscegenation, that is to say, mating across so-called racial lines, because due to Canadian influence and other demographic factors, you had a lot of the settler descendants who were mating with indigenous women. And Governor Stevens and other settlers felt that was a security risk. And so they began to arrest these fellow settlers who were mating with indigenous women, for example, and putting them in the hoosegow, for example. This will shed light, I think, on these really problematic, shall we say, anti-miscegenation laws of the United States of America, because oftentimes in terms of explaining them, they go in a different direction. So I say all this to answer your question, which is that the history of the United States, particularly as we stare down the barrel of fascism, really deserves a second and a third look. Otherwise, we'll have quite a bit to discuss in the concentration camps.
Yeah. So it bears mention that there is the chronology, the timeline that you went all the way back to 1492, the Reconquista, and even further back with the study of the Crusades and medieval anti-Semitism as a kind of sine qua non for racialization as it was transported into the Americas. But there's also the bibliographical reality that your first book published in this whole setting was actually not the 1776 book. It was Negro Comrades of the Crown. What was the process that led you from going from that book to the later books that you began in terms of just the archival research? Did you find something in the archives specifically and was like, okay, I want to come back to notice this? Or was in my case, I had a massive amount of data given to me because I had professors that collaborated with me and shared their momentous archives they accrued over their careers at Rhode Island College.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I've done all this work on the 20th century with regard to Black Americans in the Soviet Union, for example. And naturally, it occurred to me that this was not the only occasion when Black Americans facing adverse conditions might seek global alliances to countervail those who were pulverizing and oppressing us. And that, of course, leads us to Negro Comrades of the Crown, which, of course, leads to the unavoidable conclusion that there was a de facto alliance between enslaved Africans and, in fact, free Negroes in the United States and British abolitionists. I mean, after all, British abolitionists who got a shot in the arm after the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, they moved in 1807 to curtail London's role in the African slave trade. U.S. follows in 1808. And just as a footnote, I recall on the 200th anniversary of that momentous occasion, you had these momentous occasions in London. The Prime Minister spoke, for example. Now, of course, many of the Black people protested for good reason, but it went unmentioned. 1808 in the United States, when supposedly the United States moves away from the African slave trade, it goes unmentioned in this country, which also struck me. I mean, you got many more Black people in the United States than in Britain, and shouldn't we be marking that occasion, for example? And so that led me to Negro Comrades of the Crown. It led me to Frederick Douglass, as many historians have pointed out, at a time when London and Washington were at swords' point. Spending considerable time in London, for example, drumming up support. Of course, a few decades later, his protege, Ida B. Wells Barnett, in terms of organizing the anti-lynching crusade, once again goes to London. In my current book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, and likewise with regard to Negro Comrades, I talk about the War of 1812, August 1814, when Black people joined the Redcoats and chasing James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly out of the White House, one step ahead of the posse, and then jump, that is to say, the formerly enslaved, jump on British boats sailing to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. In the Negro Comrades book, I talk about the alliances between Black people and the indigenous, particularly in Florida, the people we refer to as the Seminoles, and the bloody wars that they fought with the U.S. government circa 1819, the 1830s, the 1850s. And, at a certain point, of course, we have to ask ourselves, why has it been so difficult for many of our friends on the left to recognize these sorts of stories? And I think that perhaps, sadly enough, it might be asking too much to request that settler descendants engage in scrutiny of their ancestors, for example. Perhaps the settler descendants feel that it would reflect ill upon them if they were to do an exhaustive study of settler colonialism. By the way, that term conspicuously absent from ordinary vocabularies. And indeed, if I were an Israeli patriot, which is hard to imagine, needless to say, I'd wonder, why is it that these people on the left, they're always talking about settler colonialism in historic Palestine, but not in the United States of America, for example? I'm surprised the Israeli patriots have not charged anti-Semitism, their usual allegation. But in any case, once again, these are questions worthy of ventilation, which is to restate the obvious.
What's really interesting about New York Comrades that jumps to mind is the contrast of the reaction from so-called friends on the left as compared to the 1776 book in your later work, like we saw around the time of the 1619 Project. It kind of what implicitly suggests to me is that it's okay to have these books describing African-American people who are enslaved. They're implicitly being a form of collaborationist with the imperial power. But as soon as you jump to the next logical conclusion and say the reason for collaboration isn't due to some latent imperialism, it's because they are opposing their captors, that seems to escape people on the left who want to rage this polemic against the 1619 Project. What's your thoughts on that one?
Well, what's interesting is that there are few people, even those who consider themselves to be proud anti-Stalinists, who object to the Moscow-Washington alliance between 1941 to 1945. The only individuals I can think of who have quibbled about it is Pat Buchanan, the former GOP presidential aspirant. I'm not even sure if he's still alive. I can't recall. And the late Herbert Hoover. And so, in other words, in order for Washington to rescue itself, it's okay for it to make an alliance with the Soviet Union, even though you say you hate the Soviet Union, you hate Stalin, blah, blah, blah. But with regard to an enslaved population, for example, who are enmeshed in what you say that you celebrate, which is class struggle, because what we have of class struggle in this settler regime disproportionately comes from the descendants of the enslaved population, everything from malingering up to armed assaults on the state. You say you like class struggle, well, there it is. But somehow, even though you don't raise a quibble about an alliance with Moscow, you'll raise a quibble or even a ruckus about enslaved aligning with London. I mean, I can't tell you how I've been queried, interrogated, if not pummeled from pillar to post with regard to defending my enslaved ancestors, for example. And once again, I think the bottom line is, ask these U.S. patriots to give us an analysis of the Native American question that does not involve the ignoring of genocide, for example, because obviously to construct this so-called republic, it required genocide. It required not only genocide, but it required class collaboration amongst the European settler descendants. I mean, it's obvious as the nose on your face. And if it's not, stay tuned for my book on comparative settler colonialism in Canada and North America and in the United States, aforementioned, because one of the things I point out is that with regard to the settlers in Oregon Territory and in Washington Territory, the settlers in Oregon, they tried to ban all Negroes. That's one of the reasons why Portland has one of the smallest populations of African descent of any major city, because they thought the Africans would align with the indigenous, with the Cayuse, the Walla Walla, et cetera, because they were looking at Florida, which I just mentioned, with those sorts of alliances. Washington Territory was a bit more flexible, but their problem was even more significant in a sense, because they charged repeatedly that the Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, just going into bankruptcy in 2025, interestingly enough, being bought by a Chinese billionaire. There's an irony there somehow. And they charged repeatedly that the Hudson Bay Company was arming the indigenous to harass the settlers across the border in Washington Territory. Hudson Bay Company, which was an exemplar of extractive colonialism, their model of development involved extracting lumber, fur, etc. They were pushed more dramatically into settler colonialism after gold was uncovered in British Columbia and the Euro-Americans flooded across the border. Interestingly enough, the governor, the founding father of British Columbia, Sir James Douglas, was a man of African ancestry, of course. I oftentimes wondered what would have happened if his melanin quotient would have been uncovered by these racially obsessed settlers who he oftentimes had to interact with in Washington Territory and in Oregon, for example. And in any case, what he did in order to try to stem the onslaught of the Euro-Americans was to extend an invitation to all the Black people in San Francisco circa 1858. This is when the gold rush took place, to move en masse to British Columbia, which they did, because they were being hammered in San Francisco, for example. So, I mean, I guess I'm supposed to either ignore that or somehow say, why are these U.S. Negroes aligning with Imperial London, for example? Why don't they align with the working class, Washington and Oregon, who of course wanted to kill them? You know, you should align with people who want to lynch you. I mean, no wonder we're staring down the barrel of fascism.
Yep. So now that you have gotten through the bulk of this antebellum period, beginning as far back as the Crusades, what are some major retrospective things that you come out of the other end of the tunnel with that you didn't think about when you started?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, oftentimes what happens is I try to get people to write books and I fail, and then I decide, okay, fine, I got to do it. I may be in the middle of another process because, as you know, the Dawning of the Apocalypse book in the title is the 16th century, but as you know, it goes back to the 15th century. Actually, it goes back to the 13th century. If you look at the forced exile of the Jewish population of London, which I see as pivotal to understanding the construction of whiteness, the integration to a degree of those of Jewish ancestry and to the highest reaches of the U.S. ruling class, for example, how it precedes the Inquisition inaugurated by His Catholic Majesty in España, for example. But I would like to see someone go back to trace the tortuous route that brought us to this point from the end of the 13th century up to the end of the 15th century. And of course, that would incorporate in particular 1453, when the Muslim forces, as they were then called, are able to seize control of Istanbul. And of course, as I point out in the Dawning the Apocalypse book, even after that, they had designs on the Vatican. The Vatican was next, for example. But how that fits in to a larger story of the rise of the North Atlantic powers is a project well worth considering. Likewise, and here's another project that's worth considering that I've been thinking about, which is the relationship, matter of fact, you're in a position to tackle this subject, the relationship between Quebec and its neighbors to the south. I mean, for example, one of the things I've uncovered in terms of this aforementioned project on Pacific Northwest Canadian Southwest are the role of the French settlers. They were oftentimes the ones accused of mating with the indigenous. In fact, you have this entire population in Canada, as you probably know, the Métis, who are still with us, descendants of this sort of mating, for example. And they were always being accused. As well, they were being accused, the Catholics, and of course they were heavily Catholic. The Catholics were being accused of arming the indigenous as well in the Pacific Northwest, the Catholics and the French Canadians. So I think it was in my 1776 book when I talk about the slave revolt in New York in 1712, and I intimate that it was influenced by French forces across the border. We also know that John Russwurm, Russwurm, the founder of Freedom's Journal, regarded as the first organ of the Negro press. He spent a good deal of his youth in Quebec. Of course, he attended Bowdoin College, Bowdoin, in Maine, which of course is also the alma mater of Z. Kwame Mamdani, the mayor-in-waiting of New York City. Russwurm also wound up migrating to Liberia. And so we need a story about the relationship between the French and the Quebecois and the neighbors to the south. And particularly, I tried to point this out in the article done with these quasi-patriot U.S. historians. They were not thrilled with it, so I'll probably have to publish it separately. Where I asked the question, okay, there were 13 colonies that revolted in 1776. Why didn't Quebec revolt? I mean, they were disgruntled. They're still disgruntled with Anglo rule. As a matter of fact, one of the things I found out living in Canada for most of the year is that historically in Canada, the line was that the bosses speak English, the workers speak French. And this, of course, bespeaks the real and perceived discrimination that the Quebecois felt that they received under London's rule. So why didn't they revolt, for example? I mean, as we oftentimes tell graduate students, you have to ask proper questions to get proper answers. And if you don't ask proper questions, you probably won't get proper answers. And it's rather staggering with this huge literature produced in 1776. So little attention has been paid, as Arthur Conan Doyle might have put it, to the dogs that didn't bark, for example. What does that tell us, for example? But, these folks are not necessarily interested in the kind of intellectual exploration that one can hope for.
Right. So
you should do that book on Quebec.
Might be in the works, possibly.
Good.
What I wonder is your experience in terms of the international reception for your work. I know you've had the opportunity to publish, say, in Cuba. I know Canada, being Anglophone, has the ability to easily get these books. Other Anglophone countries just as easily. And it's fascinating to consider cross-cultural reception of this stuff.
Well, it's interesting. So my book on Brazil's slavery, where I posit a huge role of U.S. enslavers in delivering Africans to Brazil, it's translated into Portuguese. My book on Cuba which deals a lot with slavery, translated in Cuba into Spanish. My book on the Haitian Revolution is on the verge of being published in Quebec in French. I just got an invitation, believe it or not, from Cambridge University in the UK to come speak on 1776. I had to turn them down because for various reasons. But I think we're living through a moment. We're in the middle of the tunnel right now. And I think at the other end of the tunnel, when we exit, will be a reevaluation of the United States, in part prompted by this 250th anniversary that we're about to endure, the Ken Burns documentary and all the rest. And I think that particularly abroad, the erstwhile allies of the United States are not necessarily in a mood to celebrate the founding of the United States of America, particularly when you have, I remember when I was in Canada, this was in the spring of this year, when Mr. Trump was making all these threats to Canada. And the French sent nuclear submarines to Nova Scotia, for example. That didn't get that much attention in the United States. Got a lot of attention in Canada, by the way. And also, on that same note, for sports fans, look at the headlines with regard to the Ryder Cup, RYDER, this golf competition, which Mr. Trump attended a few days ago, golf competition between the United States and Europe. Wow. I mean, the invective heaped upon the European golfers by these Euro-Americans was just repulsive and incredible. As a matter of fact, I was thinking to myself, if this was a sports competition involving black people, where black people were dropping F-bombs at golfers, there'd be interrogation of our family histories and the alleged failings of black mothers, all the rest, you see. And so I say all that to say that, once again, I think we're in the middle of a process whereby there will be an agonizing reappraisal of the founding of the United States of America. But sadly and tragically, I don't necessarily expect our friends on the left to be in the vanguard of this trend. I really don't. And then that's sad. That's unfortunate. Because I think what happens, as you know, particularly with regard to revolutionary movements, is that revolutionaries are given a certain amount of elasticity to analyze their own setting, their own history, for example. I mean, recall what happened in the United States in 1944 and 1945, when Jacques Duclos of the French Communist Party intervened with regard to the internal affairs of the U.S. Communist Party, with regard to what was called Browderism. That was seen as extraordinary, because it's extraordinary for revolutionaries overseas to tell people in a certain country what they need to do. And I think that that's hampered, to a certain extent, our understanding of the history of our country, given the failings, which I've articulated in the last few moments, the failings that we've had to endure, particularly the indigenous population, which have gotten a real raw deal from many of our friends on the left, and the black population, to a certain degree, the same.
Okay. You have written these books simultaneous with what I think is the prelude to entering the tunnel, if not the entrance of the tunnel, by which I mean the election of Barack Obama, the birth of the Tea Party, and the ascendancy of Donald Trump as a kind of epitome of birtherism. I mean, we're talking about a politician whose entire political career is predicated upon birtherism. He never even was on a school board or city council position. And so what comes to mind is that we have contemporary moments ahead of us particularly or namely transphobia and Islamophobia, that I think are directly concordant with elements you're discussing, because uh, you touched on the way that racialization was linked with the Crusades and the equation of phenotype with heresy in the form of Ottoman Turks. And then in terms of transphobia and gender issues, uh, we know from archaeology on the indigenous Americas about the so-called Two-Spirit or Wewa, who uh, demonstrate to the historical record, just in pure observation, that the indigenous did not have a European concept of the binary gender role. And so, what I wonder is what kind of reflections or ideas jump to mind for you in reflecting upon the way those uh, matters impact our discourse today?
Huh. Well, I think that's obvious. I mean, uh, I noticed Winsome Sears. This is the black woman conservative who's running for governor of Virginia. She was she's been lagging in the polls, and what she's unveiled of late is a new set of ads, which ads that were thought to be wielded against the Democrats successfully in 2024. That is to say, an ad that says, "I'm for you. Uh, my opponent is for they and them," for example. Attacking the whole pronoun question, for example. It's very intriguing to try to put this question of transphobia in a wider context. As I oftentimes tell my students, when you look at the patriarchy, for example, we understand that it and its close cousin, male supremacy, have roots that predate the era of white supremacy. The roots are, in many ways, deeper. And I see transphobia to a degree as being an offshoot of the challenges to patriarchy, the challenges to male supremacy, the challenge to heteronormativity, the challenge to heteropatriarchy, the challenge to sexism, for example, and that it's a way to then rally either unwitting forces or retrograde forces to, as our friends on the left might say, vote against their class interests, for example. And although obviously, as I've tried to suggest in our preceding conversation, it's a bit deeper than that, but that'll do as a stand-in for now. And so I think that what that bespeaks is, as your opening comments suggested, a deeper analysis of the anthropology of this country, because oftentimes I think a mistake is made to see the United States, the settler colony, as really just being an extension of Europe. And it is to a degree, but you had forces on the ground here that preceded the arrival of the settlers that continued to influence settler culture. And you may want to ask yourself if the transphobia, which is so redolent nowadays, is some sort of backlash against Native American culture, for example. I mean, that's a question that needs to be posed, and it's a question that can be answered. And here's another project for you. You might not necessarily have to travel for this project as well, unlike traveling to Quebec. That is to say, looking at settler narratives, looking at the narratives of captivity, for example. There's a huge library of European settlers who were captured, quote unquote, by Native Americans.
Quite familiar with them.
Yes. And so you can thumb through the literature, much of which will be online because the copyright is expired. And then being inventive in terms of the keyword searches that you use, and try to see how the Europeans were reacting to indigenous culture, for example, particularly the two-spirit phenomenon, for example. Now, perhaps this work has been done. I can't say if it has been, but if it has been done, it needs to be popularized, which is where a person like yourself comes in.
Gotcha. And I know this might be going further into the weeds than you might desire, but how has it been to be a historian after the fall of the Soviet Union, tackling these issues in lieu of Foucault, post-structuralism, postmodernism, Derrida, and varieties of other historiography that did bring some complementary elements, like, say, standpoint epistemologies around various groups that might not otherwise have been granted such dignity, but then also created quite a morass in other elements?
Well, before I answer that question, let me ask you to respond, and I'll bounce off of your response.
I think, in my sense, it's been 50-50 mix. There is, for example, the growth in trans and other minority awareness that has been popularized, for example, in the big controversy of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 manual, which removed transgender identity and gender dysphoria from disorder into just a normative place. And that connotes an entire politics. But then simultaneously, Foucault's notion of, micro revolution and what the late Murray Bookchin called lifestyle anarchism, that your daily rebellious action of wearing a subversive t-shirt is your act of revolution that day, and it's all that's necessary. Eating peanut butter and jelly sandwich without the crust attached is equivalent to storming the Winter Palace. I think that's been very poisonous.
And you seem to say that without a smile on your face too.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you're serious, but
I have encountered it.
Oh, I see. But with regard to the other aspect of your question, as I've already indicated, perversely enough, I think that my work was liberated by the fall of the Soviet Union, the implosion of the socialist camp, because I think it freed me to examine questions anew. And that's something the ruling class needs to consider. I'm doing a book on China now, and it's part of the strength of the U.S. ruling class is also their weakness. By that meaning, they can be very single-minded, like trying to bring down the Soviet Union, ignoring collateral consequence, like that involves a deal with China, for example. Now they're trying to bring down China. Very single-minded, although that's going to be a harder lift, to put it mildly. And not even considering something I've been warning these people about. They really should read my work. I've been warning them that as you focus on China, do not lose sight of the India-Japan duopoly, which stretches back thousands of years. Do not lose sight of what you should have learned during World War II with the rise of Japanese nationalism. And by the way, with the Prime Minister in waiting, Takaichi, the Tokyo Margaret Thatcher, about to be sworn in, a throwback to the nationalists of the 1940s. You really need to think about this sort of thing. I mean, I know you like to be single-minded, have this laser-like focus, tunnel vision, to coin a phrase. And so I say all that to say that obviously they didn't think, I guess to an extent that they were right, that if you have such a temblor as the collapse of the socialist camp. It won't have collateral consequences, like perhaps we need to revisit the origins of this country. Just like, as I pointed out before, understandably, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a lot of analysts who were trying to figure out why did that happen? My take, and I think that's legitimate, my take is to say, why did the United States, why were they so single-minded with regard to this one project, spending trillions, allowing for the rise of China, for example? And of course, I pointed out what I see to be the roots of anti-communism, socialism associated with the uncompensated expropriation of private property, the overthrow of the enslaving class in 1865, associated with the uncompensated expropriation of private property, since this huge investment in the billions was seized without compensation. The enslavers said it violated the Constitution, which under the Fifth Amendment says no seizing of private property without due process of law. They didn't feel that Civil War, I guess, was due process of law. And so I see therein the roots of a virulent anti-communism, which then helps to shed light on the reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and its progeny, for example. But I may be making unreasonable demands to suggest that a U.S. ruling class might have something other than false consciousness.
Gotcha. Do you have any thoughts in closing before I let you go? Because this has been a magnificent interview today.
Oh, thoughts in closing. Well, let's see. I'm doing this book on China. So I was just in the Carter Library in Atlanta before the shutdown. And so this is when you have the great leap forward in terms of full diplomatic relations. As a matter of fact, the Democrats, they were always charging that Kissinger and Nixon, they were faking the funk. You know, they had the overture to China, but they didn't follow through. You know, and of course the Democrats, since they made the deal with the labor movement and the black movement to move away from foreign policy in the 1950s during the Red Scare, they had more flexibility. And so in this one memo, I think this is after Brzezinski goes to China, right before diplomatic relations. So he writes a memo to Carter. So he has Deng Xiaoping and the other Chinese leaders about their relations with Moscow. And Deng Xiaoping says something to the effect that this will last for 10,000 years, this conflict. And then I think Carter underlines 10,000 years. So I guess he was saying, we're good. You know, I mean, we can make this deal. I mean, come on, 10,000 years. Who knows what will happen in 10,000 years? I mean, I think we can go for this. You know, it's hardly lasted 30 to 40 years. As a matter of fact, the title of my book, and I'll end on this point, is The Long Detour, the Sino-Soviet Split and the Rise and Fall of U.S. Imperialism. In other words, the Sino-Soviet split contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, creation of unipolarity, the sole remaining superpower. But alas, the price that was paid was this massive direct foreign investment. And by the way, the first U.S. ambassador to China post-1949 was Leonard Woodcock, the former leader of the United Auto Workers, who was instrumental in the shepherding of entire industrial plants across the Pacific to China, as the auto workers back home were singing the blues, for example. So anyway, look for that book at better bookstores everywhere, sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Gerald Horne. It is always a pleasure, and we deeply appreciate your time today.
Hey, send me the link.
Will do. Thank you so much.